In various aspects of how our government is structured, we've been hearing bits and pieces with regards to things having to be reformed, whether it's local government or advancing to big autonomy or procurement legislation finally being declared without a regulator, without the chairman of the Procurement Regulatory Board. However, one of the things that it's always there on the side or in the background. It pokes its head every now and then, but never necessarily in a big way. Something that I think is, though, an important issue for a lot of people thinking with regards to the long-term politics is campaign finance reform. And with us, we have this morning our usual Wednesday contributor to more or less discuss that important issue that she has once again brought to my attention. So I can't say that it's my idea. Mrs. Nunez-Tesheira, former Minister of Finance, an attorney at law / scholar, teacher to all of those who we now lament their legal opinion on national conversations.
And thank you very much for that long-winded introduction, but I appreciate it. And as you said, contributed to a lot of our attorneys at law. I do want at some point to acknowledge the article today on Dina Sital, but I'll start with, of course, what we are here about, and the reason why will become clear. But I do want to start with the issue of the campaign financing. And one will say, well, why bringing it up now? Well, we're bringing it up now because Munila Lalman, who was the regulator for 5 years, his term of office came to end in January of this year, did say on another program that as president of the Chamber of Commerce, that they had been, I don't know if the word is pressuring, but encouraging certainly the government to pass both the procurement legislation as well as the campaign financing legislation. And when he was speaking about it, he said the reason for that is because the whole idea behind the procurement legislation was to prevent, to have transparency, accountability, deal with corruption in the award of contracts based on, obviously, and oftentimes the finances of the party being given preferred treatment, and not only in terms of the award of contracts, but also the disposal of state lands, as well as the way in which they deal with legislation, meaning that they are not treating with the legislation, with the expedition that it deserves. So those are the things that they had said, and lo and behold, they passed the procurement legislation. What's unfortunate, and two key parts, which I don't know if people were aware of, but two key parts that had only just proclaimed, which were key parts, was Section 7, which deals with which kinds of contracts are subject to the procurement regulator. And secondly, I think it might be Section 23, I'm not quite sure, but the disposal of state lands. It's unfortunate that they did not leave Mr. Lalman in place, only to act as a sort of understudy for the new person, because he did a tremendous amount of training with persons. He did a tremendous amount of work in providing the handbooks and also the review procedure. They got training from the High Court and Court of Appeal. So enough of that. So now we look at the campaign legislation. And he said why it needed to be passed. It is those very financiers who are the ones who are seen or appear to benefit from government procurement contracts, government contracts, as well as seem to have a say in a number of other areas. And the Prime Minister actually alluded to that on Family Day on Sunday, where he actually said, some say that that we give contracts to people, preferential treatment to certain people, and that we delay the passage of legislation. Well, if you wanted an example of a delay of passage of legislation, it's this. And it's not called the Campaign Financing Act. It's an amendment to the 1967 People's Act, and it's the People's Amendment Bill, because it's still in bill form 2020. But what I want to say very early is that he was in Parliament on July the 30th, 2020, 10 days 10 days before the national elections. And this is what he said. He said, upon entering office as Prime Minister, I made a solid commitment to people to bring campaign finance reform legislation. That's what he said that time. He said that in 2015. Okay, so now 8 years later. Well, his idea of bringing it, maybe he didn't say when, he just said he's going to bring it. Or maybe, you know, I don't know.
When I leave, it'll be in place.
Yeah,
I mean, one could say that that's kind of how procurement went. When the former partnership left, it got the ball rolling, and it's been delayed still, but now it's finished. And so,
well, I don't think that's what he intended us to take from that. He intended us not to take that from it. And 8 years later, and he made the point too, he doesn't need the opposition's support. He made the point because it was an address to Parliament on that day. So one of the newspapers actually published verbatim what he said. And he said it's a simple majority bill, meaning he doesn't need the other side to support him. On another show, I had someone who's very familiar with the legislation and actually had given stakeholder comments on it and said the legislation is a very solid piece of legislation. And I asked, well, wouldn't it come into the difficulty of having to then say we have to pass regulations and that's what, so he says, no, it's very, very detailed. And so that's what he said. So the Prime Minister himself, just to say, Sean, he said, he acknowledged what was the weaknesses. He said, the 1967 People's Act does not punish political parties for misuse and misapplication of funding, creating opportunities, this is what he said, for corruption and money laundering. So he understood why it was important. He says, as it currently stands, there's no obligation on financiers of political parties and candidates to disclose their contribution to the public. Financial expenditure applies to parties, candidates only, but not to the parties. It does not regulate an incumbent government's access to state resources before and during election, meaning all those advertisements, when they have their advertisements or when they have their so-called talk fest. It does not formally recognize political parties as distinct legal entities. He says not only the public is not required to disclose an account for full campaign expenditure to EBC, but it limits it to, I think, 50,000 or maybe 500. But the point is he understood what it is. And this is what he said as why it was necessary to pass it. He said in 2020, he said in the purpose of the law, he said it allows for political equity, lowered campaign costs, preserving integrity and credibility of the political system, ensuring transparency through disclosure, non-discrimination, and equitable access to public funding. So probably I would go through some of the things the major changes.
Well, a couple of observations. First of all, I find it very, very, I am slightly surprised, although I shouldn't be, on the fact that not only does Parliament recognize political parties and our political system for central government general elections, it's more or less just centered around political parties. And how the nation treats with it is centered around political parties. So it's both formal and informal, right? Because we see even in the THA that technically does not recognize political parties. The voting population wants to make that into an important factor. The fact that it does not recognize political parties as distinct legal entities.
For campaign funding purposes.
But that's
I'm
the
just
point.
saying,
That's the point. That's a big deal. A political party should be a legal entity that you should be able to hold it accountable, especially when you're talking about money. Of all the things that a political party has to be transparent about and be held accountable about. That's it. That's the main thing that might be, for almost all intents and purposes, the only thing. So I find that interesting. The other thing is that the Prime Minister's statements also implies or alludes to the concept of the fact that, look, transparency will give you credibility. I'm just not entirely sure to what extent he would actually commit to that, because it's good for him to try to put this in place, because if he is both the person that is seen as the one that put it in place and then operated his administration under such campaign reform, right, where it's more transparent and he could be held more accountable, he would garner more credibility. But will that happen?
If it's not too late.
Exactly.
If it's not too late. But what are the changes that it brings? So I want to just highlight the major changes. So I think my point that I'm trying to bring to the viewers and listeners is this. It is not that our Prime Minister is unaware of the importance of campaign financing legislation. He himself said the current law that we have, the 1967 law, is a recipe for corruption and money laundering. So we are not dealing with a situation where he's not aware. And he also gave a commitment to pass it. Now it's just 2 years before elections, and based on the trajectory, I shouldn't say trajectory because they're usually going upwards, so based on the pace at which they took to eventually pass the procurement legislation, I don't think anybody should hold their breath. So he pointed out, which I'll just point out very briefly, some of the key provisions of the Act, which he spoke about, not someone else, but he spoke about. One of the major changes is creating an Office of the Registrar of Political Parties. So that would be a division within the EBC, and their duties are that you have to be classed as a political party. So registering a symbol, a logo, a name that's so close to another party's name, and so on, those kinds of things will not be allowed. So they sort of are monitoring those parties, but you have to be registered in order to gain any of the advantages that registration provides. But of course, it would be a separate office, and it would, I think, based on my looking at some of the provisions, it involves a lot of work, because once you register, you have to have audits have to be done, accounting for the funding and a provision of statements of account by the executive officers party. So they're going to have to look it over, make sure, review it. They also say that in donations, any contribution over 50,000, which is tax deductible, must be publicly disclosed, the ID of the person or donor, the nature of the amount, and the date. So in American advertisements, you see an advertisement driven by, and it's something organization for some right. So yeah. We will have to do that now. Also, they're also saying in terms of advertising, it's only persons who qualify as eligible promoters will be allowed to participate. I don't know. And other things that they said, which are very important. He said allocation of state funding. There will be some allocation of state funding, and it will be done on, they're using very clear objective yardsticks to determine that. Very important too, they say state media access, the print and electronic, not less favorable access. There should be non-discrimination to other parties, and also at the time when you're likely to reach a larger audience. The big thing, of course, is, which I thought was a big thing, restrictions on contracts to donors. They say a contractor who gives a contract over $2 million within the last 2 years, they would not be eligible to make a contribution.
That would be a huge thing. Yes.
And they also said that the anonymous donors, they also have restrictions on that. So based on what I have said, they also have the power, that is this special registrar, the power to register, deregister, merge, create coalitions of parties, and audit parties and review the audits of parties. So they seem to be operating within the EBC as a separate entity with certain powers. And once the legislation is passed, of course, in any case, and we know that in Trinidad, I mean, it's the world over, but we know that for Trinidad. It's not the legislation, it's the implementation and enforcement, because you know that the United Nations had to say, and not the United States had to say, that although we pass all this legislation, anti-money laundering and corruption legislation, it's that been not one conviction for corruption under that legislation. That's how many years ago? So we know, let's not go jumping thing, but let's hope that people listening will use their voices to at least have the legislation passed and to ask the government why they have not. And one last point, I was informed that about 15 stakeholders gave submissions to the government in relation to the changes to be made to the Act. And they all said, none of them have been invited to speak, and the Joint Select Committee last meeting was in February, I understand. So let's have your voices heard. This is important legislation, and what we want to see less corruption and less money laundering and less drugs.
Well, we will get to that linkage after we have to go for a break. Just some quick takeaways. The criteria for who these eligible marketing promoters or advertisers, that's a big question.
Yeah.
The independence of the regulatory body, that's another big question.
That's a very big question.
But
yes.
one last thing I'd like to point out. At the very least, at least the Prime Minister is bringing this up before the next general election, because it would be very easy for him, hold on, hear me out. It would be very easy for him to let the general election happen.
You know when he brought it up, you heard what I said?
I know,
So
but
what did I say?
Didn't he also bring it up again at the Family Day?
Because we did the procurement, and once the procurement legislation was passed, pressure was put on him by Lalman to say you can't pass the procurement without the campaign.
I understand, but pressure has been put on him with regards to passing the procurement
but
for
Lalman
years,
was the
right?
head of the regulator.
I know, but I'm just saying,
all right.
he could have very easily have brought it up after the next general election, so he would, for his final term, he wouldn't have to deal with it. Now, will it actually be passed is still something that we have to wait to be seen.
Will it be actually enforced?
And right. Will it be proclaimed? It might be passed and not proclaimed.
No, it could be. No, it's not only passed. I don't think it needs proclamation because it's not a special majority bill. But not just assented to, but will it be enforced? That's the question to ask. Now, when you answer that question, then
so as Karen said, implementation. Folks, let's take a break. When we come back, we will take the topic a little bit wider in scope. Stay tuned. This is Talking Point on WESN, your content capital.